Thanks for now.
Well, all military cooperation and engagements between the United States and Russia have now been suspended by President Obama. Here's how America's reporting the news.
Tonight, breaking news on Ukraine. World markets fall, fears rise over a superpower confrontation.
At the brink, Vladimir Putin flexing his muscle in the face of a new warning from the White House.
Good evening. It is unclear how this ends, but it's very clear that Vladimir Putin is not troubling himself with what the rest of the world has to say.
Well, we can talk about this now with Steve Yates, who was an advisor to former Vice President Dick Cheney. Good morning to you, Steve. See a Republican a bit more hawkish, but if you were advising the Democrat President Barack Obama now, what would you say to him?
Well, I would first recommend that he recognize that the world isn't as he wished it would be. He, after all, was elected and re-elected on a declaration that the tide of war is receding, and sought comity and cooperation with allies and adversaries alike. Unfortunately, when you look at the broader Middle East and now Eastern Europe, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. We have Vladimir Putin presenting a significant challenge, a strategic challenge, invading the sovereignty of neighboring states, violating agreements made in the past. And so we didn't choose to have this kind of a conflict, but we really need to think carefully about how we respond together to this kind of a challenge.
So how should we respond then is the obvious next question.
Right. Well, President Obama has mentioned several times there need to be costs. I think his rhetoric has been closer to the mark where a majority of Americans are, but the question is whether it has credibility given the red lines drawn in Syria and other conflicts where our policy has seemed to have been a muddle. They seem to be talking about pulling back from the G8. There is, I think, a reasonable question to ask what the purpose of the G8 is. If Russia is going to behave this way, perhaps they shouldn't be involved in the institution at all. But we also need to look at there being real economic consequences for Russia's action. Access to our banking systems, trading with us shouldn't be business as usual, and I think our government is looking at what the options are.
Steve, the fear is that this could be the start of yet another Cold War. And I know you've said that perhaps providing arms to the Ukrainians could be the way forward, but then we're in yet another arms race, the likes of which we saw through the 70s and 80s.
But the alternative to that is to leave innocent people seeking self-determination and independence to be vulnerable who are already being armed by a foreign intervening force. So we have to decide, and it's a legitimate debate that our people have to be engaged in at some point. Does the freedom of the people in Eastern Europe or elsewhere in the world matter to our own freedom and prosperity? Are we going to do something to help them? I would think the people in Poland who seem unnerved by these moves are going to be more motivated than perhaps Western Europe will be to take risks. We should at least be clear that we will not impose sanctions on them if they so choose. And if there's material support we can provide to what I agree with Secretary Kerry is the legitimate government of Ukraine, they can decide how best to use those funds.
Steve Yates in Idaho in the United States.